What I'm going to do here is talk more about Mars's synodic cycle with the sun. This talk was originally given to the Portland astrology group run by Nicholas Palomenakis around the Kazemi last year. So shout out to him, as well as Devin Malone, who helped give some feedback after that initial delivery to edit and refine this presentation. So just to forewarn you, this is actually going to be more astronomical than astrological in nature. However, I think, those two sciences, arts, so to speak, were once indistinguishable. And I think all of us astrologers would benefit from having a clearer understanding of astronomy, because there's a lot that happens symbolically, astronomically, that can inform what also takes place astrologically. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce myself first. For those who don't know me, my name's Caleb McCoy. I started studying astrology, Hellenistic astrology in earnest, really back in 2018. In 2020, I decided to pursue formal certification with Adam Ellenboss's Nightlight Astrology School. And I did his year one program and finished in 21. I do have a BA in philosophy, and I think that greatly influences how I approach astrology. And in addition to doing astrology, I'm also a dad. I teach full-time. I'm a drummer and a poet, and also a heavy metal enthusiast, right? My platform is a marriage of some of those great loves, right? And my own Mars placement is, we're on the opposite side of the zodiac from Whitney. I have Mars in Libra, conjunct Spica and Arcturus. And there's my socials and my website if you want to follow me. All right, so what even is a synodic cycle, right? A synodic cycle is the relationship between two different celestial bodies when observed from our vantage point on Earth. And it's not just, the sun and any given planet. It can be any number of planets and their relationships to each other. So much of our job as astrologers is to examine and qualify and explain relationships between ourselves, between the planets and the Earth, right? The sort of prototypical, I think, synodic cycle would be the moon and the sun, the lunar month, which we all know relatively well. It's one of the easiest ones you can learn coming into astrology, and is quite visibly evident over the period of 29.5 days that it lasts. But today we'll be talking about the synodic cycle, or the relationship between Mars and the sun. And why, right? Why bother? And to some degree, I think it's just a good matter of timing. Recently, this past Wednesday, Mars formed a superior trine to the sun, and that is a moment in Mars's synodic cycle that indicates that Mars is about to station retrograde. This is true of any superior planet. But there are additional bits about Mars's synodic cycle that I find really interesting, that I think makes it unique when compared against both the inner planets of Mercury and Venus, as well as other superior planets such as Jupiter and Saturn. So Mars actually has the longest solar synodic period. You can see there's a chart on the right-hand side that shows the number of days for each planet's, the classical planets, their solar synodic periods, with Mars's being the longest. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that Mars has a highly eccentric orbit, and the third most elliptical orbit after both Pluto and Mercury. It also has there's Mars's proximity to Earth, right? It's one of our closest neighbors. And also there's a big influence from Jupiter's massive gravity well that also affects Mars's orbit. That's one reason why Mars's orbit is so elliptical in shape. So as a result, the synodic period, due to the eccentricity and ellipticality of Mars's orbit, the length can vary anywhere from 762 days to 819 days, but the average is 780, and the present cycle we're in is more of the average variety in that it is lasting, or will last, 785 days. And here is an animation that shows the at least ovular shape of Mars's orbit when compared against the more circular, neat and circular ones that Earth and Venus make. This doesn't necessarily show the eccentricity of Mars's orbit, meaning that it actually is at an angle to the orbital plane when compared against Earth's orbit around the sun. So rather than being all the planets being on like a flat line together, Mars is slightly askew, right? And then Pluto is similarly askew, but even more so. And you can make of that what you want astrologically. So I want to go through just blow by blow the important moments in Mars's synodic cycle, and this portion is greatly dependent upon Robert Blaschke's book, Astrology, A Language of Life, Volume 5, Holographic Transits. He has a diagram in here that I'm essentially adapting and have altered a bit so that one can understand the way this plays out over, I said Mars' synodic cycle is 780 days roughly. That's about 2.1 years. So we're going to look at what happens over the course of those 2.1 years, those 25 to 26 months. And we're going to start with the Mars-Sun conjunction. That's the beginning of the cycle. Looking at the circular diagram on the right, consider that to be essentially the zodiac, and we're going to look at Mars's position relative to the Sun as the two of them move around the zodiac. So the new moon moment happens as the first moment in the cycle. This is the seeding point. The most recent one happened on November 17th last year when we got the cazimi at 25 degrees of Scorpio. The subsequent moment in the cycle that's worth recognizing is Mars's heliacal rise, or phasis. Phasis is a Greek term which means an appearance or saying. Manetho remarks that all the stars rejoice when they are at their rising, just as each is exalted in its own rulerships. Being on the rise, as it were, unto their youth, being quite powerful, they accomplish all things for men. The heliacal rise of a planet is important insofar as it's the moment when it is no longer invisible, right? The conjunction moment happens when Mars is under the beams of the sun, but once it hits at about 10 or 11 degrees away from the sun, then it becomes visible again. And the time that Mars spends invisible is longer than any other planet due to some of the factors we talked about earlier. Like if you think about the fact that the cazimi happened at 25 Scorpio, and it wasn't until it was, 38 degrees deeper into the zodiac at 3 degrees of Capricorn that it actually became visible and rose again, became visible as a morning star. This is Mars as oriental, visible before the sun rises. So it happens a solid month and a half after the conjunction. At this point, then we can move on to the waxing square. You can think of this as analogous to when we get the first quarter moon in the lunar cycle. And this ends the first quadrant of Mars's cycle, which lasts on average 283 days. So at this point, Mars is 90 degrees away or relative to the sun. And this always occurs when Mars enters its pre-retrograde shadow. So the most recent one fell on October 14th when Mars hit 21 degrees of Cancer, and it had entered this shadow period only 10 days prior on the 4th when it hit 17 degrees of Cancer. This, part of Mars's cycle, it's becoming visible for a longer period earlier in the morning at dawn, but we're getting closer to Mars's station date at this point. This is where we're at now in the cycle. We just hit the waxing trine only several days ago on Wednesday when Mars hit 5 degrees of Leo. And like I said, of all superior planets, this is true. We get the waxing trine in the cycle. It occurs around the time that the planet is due to station retrograde, right? So the retrograde station is happening in 6 days, I believe. But the trine happened, only a few days prior to this. It's not exact, but when you see Mars and the Sun making these aspects, you can know where you're at in terms of the overall cycle. The next stop in the cycle is the Mars-Sun opposition. This is the full moon moment. It ends the second quadrant of Mars's cycle, which lasts only roughly 106 days. This is halfway through the retrograde period and halfway through the cycle in general. At this point, Mars transitions to being an evening star, and in general, Mars is visible right after sunset and visible for the longest amount of time. It is also the point in Mars's cycle when it is closest to the Earth and therefore most apparent. It appears closest and it appears brightest. And if you're interested in just astronomical observation, this is the best time to go out and look at Mars. This opposition, the next opposition will occur on January 16th at 26 degrees of Cancer. And I will talk more about the opposition later on in the talk. Next, you have the waning trine, which occurs around the time that Mars stations direct. The next one will happen March 8th at 17 Cancer, although Mars will have technically stationed 2 weeks prior to this on February 23rd. But that's when you get the exact aspect. The next is the waning square. This ends the third quadrant of Mars's cycle. At this point, Mars is solidly an evening star, but is declining in terms of the amount of time that it is visible at night. This also ends that 105-day quadrant that you can measure from the opposition to this square, and it occurs around the time that Mars exits its pre-retrograde shadow. And you'll notice that the next one, April 20th, when Mars is at 0 degrees of Leo, is also when we get the third of the 3 Pluto-Mars trines, which are coloring this upcoming retrograde. Last, we have the heliacal set, which mirrors the heliacal rise. Mars becomes invisible as an evening star when 10 to 11 degrees away from the sun. That will happen roughly a year from now when Mars has its evening set at 6 degrees of Sagittarius. And just to show you what the start of the next one looks like, there will be a Mars-Sun conjunction in January of 2026 at 19 degrees of Capricorn, and that will end the fourth quadrant of Mars cycle, which starts at the waning square and lasts roughly 285 days. So I hope that gives like a good illustration of just how that cycle plays out along the zodiac. There are a couple peculiarities as well about Mars's cycle that I want to highlight. Since the cycles last roughly 2.1 years, the Mars-Sun conjunctions shift with each successive iteration, and usually they shift by 1 sign, but occasionally it will move by 2 signs. So like the one 2 cycles ago that started in Libra, it started in Libra. The subsequent one that we're in right now began in Scorpio, but with the subsequent one after this being in Capricorn, it's just skipping Sagittarius entirely, again because of Mars' sort of eccentricity. And then I want to cover just the retrograde, since we do have the retrograde impending now. And I think, as most of you know, a retrograde is sort of an optical illusion created by the appearance of a planet seeming to move backwards through the zodiac. Mars's in particular can last, it's not, regularly predictable, like Mercury's, which lasts roughly 3 weeks, but Mars's can last anywhere from 58 to 81 days, which is a pretty wide range. This one will last 80 days, so it's on the longer side. And if you were to watch the shape made by Mars in the sky over the course of its walking backwards, it seems to trace a zigzag or a loop-the-loop through the sky. And there's a line in Valens that seems to suggest that this is Mars, so to speak, at its most martial, because in the anthology, when listing Mars's significations, Valens says that Mars rules anapodismo or anapodismo. I don't know the exact pronunciation, but that's the technical term that Hellenistic astrologers use to describe retrogrades, which literally means walking backwards. So there seems to be this suggestion on the part of Valens that Mars partakes, or like all retrogrades partake in the nature of Mars, in that they bring stress. They indicate like the planet is going against the grain. It's going against sort of the prevailing dominant motion, right? Mars is about separation, and it seems to be separating from what the rest of the sky is doing at that given moment. And that's sort of a naturally martial, especially Mars in Aries, action, right? To stride out on one's own, to carve out one's own sort of corner in the world. And also astrology is a science of visibility. And Mars is at its most visible, at its brightest and greatest proximity to Earth during its retrograde. And therefore, I think there's a suggestion that Mars is sort of at its strongest or like most Marsy during that time period, because it is at its loudest. It's like I said, Mars's full moon occurs during that time period. And here is an illustration that shows you again how that optical illusion is created and what that view looks like from Earth. And this was a graphic I found that actually used Mars's 2020 retrograde in Aries to illustrate this process. A few more peculiarities about the opposition. So the opposition occurs when there's the smallest distance between Earth and Mars. So like I said, Mars is at its most visible, but Mars, of all planets, has the greatest variability in terms of its apparent brightness and size. Every 15 or 17 years, these oppositions will occur when Mars is at its closest proximity to the Sun, a state that's called perihelion. They can also fall at aphelion, and that's when Mars is the least visible. But when they happen at perihelion, that is the minimum, smallest possible distance between Mars and the Sun, and therefore it is very incredibly bright. The most recent fell in 2018. The next one will fall in 2035, right? 17 years after that date. And these generally occur when sidereally Mars is in Capricorn or Aquarius. And I think at the end of all this, we can ask, like, okay, great, so we understand the cycle, but what does it really mean? And I like how Austin Coppock has referred to Mars' cycle as a campaign. I've also worked in the trades, and I think Mars rules those who work with their hands. There's something about these, like the way a day unfolds at a job site that you can also use to understand these cycles. But generally speaking, it's been my experience that studying these cycles in my life and the lives of others, you find these stories with high points that map to a lot of the moments that I outlined earlier, wherein we find these stories emerging of self-assertion, conflicts, and dedication to causes. There's this seeding that occurs at the conjunction, the new moon moment. When we have the heliacal rise, there's greater glimmers of what is growing or what was started at that time. If you think of like when you sow a seed in the soil, it's not visible what actually is happening until the first shoots, the first leaves poke their heads out of the ground. That's kind of what happens at the heliacal rise. At the waxing square, we encounter challenges and limits to growth, but there's still this sense of being filled with potential. But then I think the greatest number of obstacles occur, the greatest number of challenges once we get the waxing trine and go into the retrograde period. More potentials are collapsing into actualities. There's a sense of the need to make more decisions and choices. And in making decisions and choices, we are literally killing off other possibilities for ourselves. And subsequently at the waning square, then there's a sense of constriction as we've bound ourselves to certain possibilities and foregone others, and therefore must live with the choices we have made. At that point, there's a need to sort of shore up defenses, shore up foundations, and to retreat. But that's basically all I have for Mars' synodic cycle.